Today, I'm going to give you the TLDR on how the useEffect hook works in React. So if we go to my application here, for this useEffect hook, in my previous video, we covered when you would use this hook, where it's appropriate, when you shouldn't use it. And the summary of that video is that really you shouldn't be using this useEffect hook here very often. And as you can see, this is just a function that we import from the React library. It's very similar to how you import other hooks from React, like useState, useReducer, useRef, useContext. It is just a function that we import from React that allows us to kind of hook into some React features. Now, as I was saying, you really don't want to use this very often, and it's kind of reserved for situations to where you're kind of stepping out of normal React code. So in my previous video, we kind of covered where there's kind of three different types of code in React. You have your rendering code. That's going to be like this block of code right here. All it is rendering JSX. There's not really much else to it. There's no event handlers or setting state or anything like that. But then the second type of code is like event handler code. So like right here, we have this button and then we have an onClicked where we set some state. Then we have effect code. So, this is kind of an effect, but it's in a user event triggered that effect because you click the button and then you set some other state elsewhere in your app. It is kind of a side effect, but it's also triggered by a user event. But with effects, it's going to be stuff that you use to where you need to use like a side effect, but it's not triggered by a user event. It is triggered by some other external thing. It could be, you use a useEffect hook to connect to WebSockets, or you connect to third-party APIs, or maybe you have a chat in your application and you're waiting for, well, I guess this is just WebSockets again. You're waiting for that message to come through, or you're waiting on an event, something like that. It's not based on user events, and it's not just your normal rendering code. It's some other effect. That's where you're going to use these. All right, so try not to use these too much, but how they work is that basically you import useEffect from React, just like what I did up here, but it's going to accept two arguments. Now, right now, I'm only passing it one argument. I'm passing it a function as its first argument here. And that is what your first argument should be, is a function. And by default, when I have a useEffect just like this, it is going to run on every single render of my application. So you can see right now, it's just console logging the current count. If we go back to my app and open the console, you see if I increment my count, it console logs it, which you might think, okay, this is exactly what you might want. However, when you don't pass a second argument to useEffect, like I said, it's going to run on every re-render. So if I set some unrelated piece of state, like I do here, this random number setter, it sets this random number. When I click this button down here, it sets this different piece of state, which triggers a re-render. This function within my useEffect hook, it's going to run again, or it calls this function. Okay, so the first argument is a function to the useEffect hook that you can pass. And by default, React is going to call that function that you pass to the useEffect hook on every single render. So you can see when I click random number setter, it's not even related to my code within my useEffect. I console log the count. I don't care about the random number, but you can see this like number 6 here is going to keep going up. 7, 8, 9, 10, so on and so forth. That's probably not what we want. So how can you kind of control that? Well, the second argument to the useEffect hook is, so I'm going to do comma. This comma is after my function here that I passed into the useEffect hook. I'm going to do comma, and then you could pass what's called a dependency array. So it's basically saying like, okay, for your function that you pass in as your first argument, what dependencies does that function have? Or what pieces of state does that function depend on? Well, in our case, we only care about the count. We use our count right here. So what's the dependency here? Well, it's going to be the count. So you can put that in your dependency array. And now what React is going to do is it is going to run this useEffect hook, or the function, as the first argument in these useEffect hook. It's going to run that function. And you could also pass a named function here as well. I'm just inlining an anonymous function, which is probably how you're going to see this written the most, but it's going to run this function when this component mounts, so the initial render, or anytime the count changes. So if count goes to 1, goes from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, it's going to console log our count again, and it's going to run this first function again. However, since we don't put our random number piece of state in our dependency array, which we shouldn't because our function doesn't depend on that or doesn't care about that at all, when we set the random number and it re-renders, it's not going to rerun this function, which is probably what you want to do. So normally you do want to pass a dependency array. And what you're going to see is when I increment it, you can see that it console logs the current count. But then when I hit this random number, it's not console logging the count because it's only going to trigger the recalling of my passed in function to useEffect when one of the values in the dependency array changes. Now you could pass multiple values here, and that's totally fine to do as well. But just make sure that, you shouldn't choose the dependencies. They should be things that your function actually depends on. So what I mean by that is I wouldn't want to set this up to where I'm rerunning this function when random number changes, because my function that I passed to useEffect here, it doesn't care about random number. It doesn't use it in any way. There's kind of nothing it does here that cares about it. So make sure that your dependency array or the values in your dependency array actually match what your function that you pass into useEffect depends on. Now you can use multiple useEffects in a single component. Something like this is totally fine, and all of them can have different dependency arrays, and that's perfectly okay to do. But like I said earlier, really you probably shouldn't have that. Maybe there's cases to where it makes sense, but for the most part, I like components that do not have useEffects in them. It makes it much easier to reason about. One other thing that you can do here with the useEffect hook is you can return a function from your passed in function that will run when this component unmounts. So for our useEffect demo here, if I go to a different page and we unmount our page component right here, that function is going to run. So in our passed in function, if we have a return statement and we return a function and then we, do something in this function that we return, React is going to call this return function here when this component unmounts. So if we left this useEffect demo page, React would call this return function from our passed in function, which is our first argument to our useEffect hook. A little complicated, but just know if you need to do something when your component unmounts, you go to a different page, return a function from your function that you pass in to useEffect. Now, when might you actually do this? Well, I know in my professional application, we do something like at the top of the useEffect, we might call a connect function to connect to a certain WebSocket. And then when we unmount, we'll call a disconnect function and do something like that. So connect to the WebSocket on mount. When you leave the page, we don't need to keep that connection going. We need to kind of clean that up. So we're going to return a function that is going to disconnect from that WebSocket connection. Now, let me show you one other example here. So, in your passed in function, you might have various logic. So like if count is greater than 10, then maybe here you could set your count back to 0 to reset it. And this will work, but there's a but to this. So let's first see that it works. All right, I'm going to increment this. I hit 10 and now it goes back to 0. So it's basically in this like infinite loop here. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, what are we doing here with our useEffect hook? We're actually responding to a user action, which is not what you want to do in a useEffect hook. Because we wouldn't need to use this hook whatsoever here. Let me get this random number out of our dependency array. We wouldn't need to use this useEffect at all. We could just do this when we set our count, when we increment it. We could check, okay, if this prev count is greater than 10, set it to 0. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to adjust this a little bit. By default, return prev count plus 1, but we can do if prev count is equal to 10, then we are going to return 0. And then we wouldn't even need this useEffect hook whatsoever. which is my favorite. So if you do this, we can see that we get the same effect here. We get to 10 and it goes back to 0. And this is much better practice than trying to use a useEffect hook for this to track some state and then set that state when that state is meeting a certain condition. Because like I said at the intro, this is user actions triggering the changes of this code. We don't need to use useEffect or effects for that type of action. UseEffect, like I said, is going to be something like connecting to a WebSocket. Like I think the perfect example of useEffect is, okay, when our component mounts, and if you pass an empty dependency array, that is going to mean that you are only going to run this passed-in function to useEffect when your component initially mounts. When this component initially mounts, we're going to call a connect function and connect to a WebSocket. Maybe we pass in a certain channel name there. And then what we can return is we just want to disconnect from our WebSocket. So when it mounts, it connects it. When it unmounts, we return a function from the passed in useEffect, and it's going to disconnect. Now you might have other stuff like, on mount, you need to sync your app with an external API, like a logging service or something like that. That's another great example where you might use these. But just know, like, if you're ever like responding to user actions in a useEffect, you can probably restructure your code and do some better stuff. The TLDR here on the useEffect hook is it's a function that you import from React. 2 arguments are possible. One is mandatory, and the first one is going to be a function that is by default going to run on every single render. You can also return a function from that passed-in function if you want to run some code when your component unmounts. But if not, you don't need to return any function from your passed-in function to useEffect. And then the second argument is going to be a dependency array. It's basically going to be like, all right, for your passed-in function, what does it depend on? Are there any like state variables that it uses, or what does it kind of need to stay in sync with? You're going to pass those to your dependency array. Your passed-in function, it's going to run on mount, as well as anytime one of these passed-in values of your dependency array, anytime these values change. And for the most part, you're going to want to pass a dependency array to your useEffect hooks. So hopefully this is clear. Hopefully I didn't drag on too long here. It is kind of a trickier hook, but like I said, it shouldn't be something that you use a ton. So thanks for tuning into this. I'll see you in that next one.